Welcome to Sahitya Safari. Today, we are going to hear the story of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It is a cold, wet November afternoon when the novel opens at Gateshead, the home of Jane Eyre's relatives, the Reeds. Jane and the Reed children, Eliza, John, and Georgiana, sit in the drawing room. Jane's aunt is angry with her, purposely excluding her from the rest of the family, so Jane sits alone in a window seat, reading Pickwick's History of British Birds. As she quietly reads, her cousin, John, torments her, reminding her of her precarious position within the household as orphan niece of Mrs. Reed. John throws a book at her, and she calls him a murderer and a slave driver. The two children fight, and Jane is blamed for the quarrel. As punishment, she is banished to the Red Room. As she is being dragged to the Red Room, Jane resists her jailers, Bessie and Miss Abbott. After the servants have locked her in, Jane begins observing the Red Room. It is rarely used because Uncle Reed died there. Looking into a mirror, Jane compares her image to that of a strange fairy. The oddness of being in a death chamber seems to have stimulated Jane's imagination, and she feels superstitious about her surroundings. She is also contemplative. Why, she wonders, is she always the outcast? The reader learns that Jane's uncle Reed, her mother's brother, brought her into the household. On his deathbed, he made his wife promise to raise Jane as one of her own children, but obviously, this promise has not been kept. Suddenly, Jane feels a presence in the room and imagines it might be Mr. Reed, returning to Earth to avenge his wife's violation of his last wish. She screams, and the servants come running into the room. Jane begs to be removed from the Red Room, but neither the servants nor Mrs. Reed have any sympathy for her. Believing that Jane is pretending to be afraid, Mrs. Reed vows that Jane will be freed only if she maintains perfect stillness and submission. When everyone leaves, Jane faints. Jane awakens in her own bedroom, surrounded by the sound of muffled voices. She is still frightened, but also aware that someone is handling her more tenderly than she has ever been touched before. She feels secure when she recognizes Bessie and Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, standing near the bed. Bessie is kind to Jane and even tells another servant that she thinks Mrs. Reed was too hard on Jane. Jane spends the next day reading, and Bessie sings her a song. After a conversation with Jane, Mr. Lloyd recommends that Mrs. Reed send her away to school. Jane is excited about leaving Gateshead and beginning a new life. Overhearing a conversation between Miss Abbott and Bessie, Jane learns that her father was a poor clergyman who married her mother against her family's wishes. As a result, Jane's grandfather disinherited his daughter. A year after their marriage, Jane's father caught typhus while visiting the poor, and both of her parents soon died within a month of each other and left Jane orphaned. Following her discussion with Mr. Lloyd, Jane expects that she will soon be sent away to school. After 3 months of waiting for a change, Jane is finally summoned to the breakfast room. Here, she finds Mr. Brocklehurst waiting for her. Standing like a black pillar, Mr. Brocklehurst interviews Jane about hell, sin, and the Bible. Her aunt's worst suspicions about her moral character are confirmed when Jane declares to Brocklehurst that psalms are not interesting. As a final poke at Jane, Mrs. Reed declares that her niece is a liar, and Brocklehurst promises to alert the other members of the school to Jane's deceitful nature. Jane resents Mrs. Reed's statements about her character, and when the two are alone together, Jane retaliates against her aunt. Angry and hurt, Jane declares that she is not a liar and she's glad Mrs. Reed is not her relation. And finally, that Mrs. Reed is hard hearted. Jane feels a sense of triumph and exultation, and Mrs. Reed sheepishly leaves the room. The date of Jane's departure from Gateshead has arrived. She rises at 5 o'clock in the morning so that she'll be ready for the 6 o'clock coach. None of the family rises to bid Jane farewell, and she happily journeys far away from the Reeds. The potter's wife is surprised that Mrs. Reed is allowing such a young child to travel alone. Jane's imaginative nature is once again apparent, and she worries that kidnappers will snatch her away at the inn where the coach stops for dinner. The day of Jane's arrival at Lowood is rainy, windy, and dark. Jane is led through the unfamiliar labyrinthine halls of Lowood until she reaches a large room in which 80 other girls sit doing their homework. Soon it is bedtime, and Jane wearily makes her way to bed. The next day, Jane follows the full routine of the school, studying from pre dawn until 5 o'clock in the evening. Jane discovers the kind Miss Temple and the unreasonable Miss Scatcherd, who unfairly punishes Helen Burns. While solitary and isolated through most of the day, Jane does converse with Helen, who tells Jane that Lowood is a charity institution for orphan children. She also learns that Miss Temple must answer to Mr. Brocklehurst in all she does. The next day, as Jane sits sewing, she notices once again how unfairly Helen Burns is treated. Miss Scatcherd picks on Helen for inconsequential things, such as poking her chin unpleasantly or not holding her head up. Despite Miss Scatcherd's criticisms, Helen appears to be one of the brightest students in the class. She has answers for the most difficult questions. Later in the evening, Jane converses once again with Helen. She learns more about Helen's philosophy of life and her doctrine of endurance. Helen praises Jane for her virtues, such as the ability to pay careful attention during lessons. In contrast, Helen believes she herself suffers from carelessness and poor concentration, spending too much time daydreaming about her home in Deepden. While Jane thinks Helen should fight against injustice, Helen tells her to follow Christ's example by loving her enemies. Jane's first quarter at Lowood passes, and the book records Jane's general impression of her first 3 months at the school. Again, she focuses on the harshness of life at Lowood, the severe cold, near starvation, and the long hours spent memorizing the church catechism and listening to long sermons. Fortunately for Jane, Mr. Brocklehurst, the financial manager of Lowood, is absent during most of this time. Finally, he appears at the school. Jane is worried at his arrival because she remembers Mrs. Reed's comments to him about Jane's deceitfulness. During his visit, Jane accidentally drops her slate. Brocklehurst immediately brands her as careless. Although Miss Temple tells her not to be afraid of punishment, Jane is soon made the dunce of the school. Brocklehurst stands her on a stool and announces to the entire school that Jane is a liar. No one is to speak to Jane for the rest of the day. But Helen silently supports her friend by smiling every time she passes Jane's stool. School is dismissed for tea. The spell she has been under dissolves and Jane collapses on the floor in grief. She feels all of her successes at Lowood have now been destroyed by Brocklehurst's unfair accusations. Jane wonders how Helen can be friends with a girl that the world has branded a liar. Helen tells Jane she is exaggerating. Only 80 people of the hundreds of millions in the world heard Brocklehurst, and most of those people probably pity rather dislike Jane. Miss Temple also befriends Jane, allowing her to present her side of the story. Miss Temple promises to write to Mr. Lloyd for verification of Jane's statements. If his reply agrees with Jane's, she will be publicly cleared. For Miss Temple, though, Jane is already clear. Jane and Helen share a sumptuous tea with their teacher. Mr. Lloyd replies to Miss Temple's letter, corroborating Jane's statement. So Miss Temple assembles the entire school and vindicates Jane from all of the charges Brocklehurst had levelled against her. With this load off her mind, Jane returns diligently to work, quickly rising to a higher class. Spring arrives at Lowood. With new growth comes hope. Jane finds beauty in the natural world surrounding Lowood, a beauty that had been masked by winter's frosts. But within this pleasure, there is also pain. The forest that nurtures the school, the low wood, also brings a pestilence bred by dampness, typhus. Combined with semi starvation and neglected goals, the dampness causes 45 of the 80 students to fall ill with this dangerous disease. The few who are well, including Jane, are allowed to play outside without supervision. Jane notes the contrast between the death within the school and the beauty of May outside its doors. While Jane is enjoying nature's beauty with her new friend Mary Ann Wilson, Helen Burns is slowly dying, not of typhus, but of consumption. Jane doesn't realize the seriousness of this disease until she learns from the nurse that Helen will soon die. Jane feels she must embrace Helen one last time before she dies and sneaks into Miss Temple's room, where Helen has been staying during her illness. During the two friends' final conversation, Helen insists she is happy because she will escape great suffering by dying young. Helen dies in Jane's arms while the two girls sleep. 15 years later, Jane marks Helen's grave with a grey marble tablet labeled Resurgam, meaning I shall rise again. Following an investigation into the cause of the typhus epidemic at Lowood, Mr. Brocklehurst is publicly humiliated and a new building is erected. Jane remains at Lowood for 8 years, 6 as a student and 2 as a teacher. After 2 years as a teacher, Jane needs a change. First, Miss Temple marries and moves far away, taking with her Jane's serene feelings about Lowood. Jane's old need for adventure returns, and she longs to experience the perils of the real world. Since arriving at the school, Jane has never quit it, even for holidays, and she now dreams of liberty and a new servitude. Jane places an ad in the newspaper for a job as a governess. A response arrives from Mrs. Fairfax of Thornfield, Millcote, who needs a governess for a little girl, and Jane decides to take the job. Before leaving for her new position, Jane has an unexpected visit from Bessie Lee, the Reeds' nursemaid. From her, she learns that none of the Reed children has turned out well. Georgiana tried to elope with a young man, and Eliza jealously tattled on them, and John leads a life of excess. Jane also learns that her father's brother, John Eyre had come to the Reeds seeking Jane 7 years ago. Unfortunately, he couldn't visit her at Lowood because he was leaving for Madeira to make his fortune. Jane sits waiting at the George Inn at Millcote because no one has arrived from Thornfield to pick her up. Just as Jane is becoming anxious, a servant arrives for her. Despite its imposing architecture, Thornfield is inviting. Mrs. Fairfax proves to be a neat, mild looking elderly lady who greets Jane kindly. For the first time, Jane learns of the existence of Mr. Rochester, the owner of Thornfield. Jane also discovers that her new pupil, Adele Warrens, is Rochester's ward. Adele's mother was a dancer and singer, and Adele is also an adept performer. As she tours the house with Mrs. Fairfax, Jane suddenly hears a strange, disquieting laugh. Thornfield meets up to Jane's initial expectations, calm and comfortable. Jane still longs for the busy world of the city, for variety, for conversation with her peers. A restlessness exists in Jane's nature that causes her pain. Several months pass, and one day in January, Jane takes a long walk through the fields surrounding Thornfield. As she sits on a hill, watching the moon rising, a noise breaks her reverie. A horse is coming up the lane. Jane sees a huge Newfoundland dog gliding through the bushes. A man rides into view, breaking Jane's spell. His horse slips on a patch of ice, and the man falls. Jane tells the man, who is in his late 30s and not handsome, that she is the governess at Thornfield, and helps him hobble on to his horse. Then horse, man, and dog all vanish. Meditating upon the experience, Jane is happy to have offered active assistance. She returns to Thornfield and learns that the man she helped was her employer, Mr. Rochester. Life at Thornfield changes following the Rochester's arrival. Jane and Adele are forced to abandon the library because Rochester needs to use it as a meeting room. Jane likes the place better now as it has a master. Adele finds it impossible to concentrate on her lessons because she's so busy wondering about what presents Rochester has brought for her. Jane isn't pleased with the additional ceremony of dressing up for the tea with Mr. Rochester. Jane again notes the firm decisiveness of his face, which is imposing rather than beautiful. Rochester's stiff, impatient formality with Jane intrigues her more than finished politeness would have. Questioning her about her family and discovering that her parents are dead, Rochester concludes that Jane is a witch. He then judges her accomplishments, her piano playing and drawing. While he finds her playing average, Rochester is impressed by Jane's drawings. Mrs. Fairfax tells Jane more of Edward Rochester's history. His father, old Mr. Rochester, and brother, Roland, plotted against him, so Edward was forced into a painful position of which Mrs. Fairfax knows nothing. Edward broke away from the family, only returning to Thornfield 9 years ago when his brother died and he thus inherited the property. Finally, one evening, he summons Adele and Jane, offering Adele her long awaited present. Jane notices that Rochester is in a friendlier mood than usual, probably due to his dinner wine. Rochester enjoys Jane's frank, sincere manner and confesses that he hasn't lived the purest, most innocent life. They discuss sin, remorse, and reformation. Finding Jane a good listener, Rochester speaks to her as freely as if he were writing his thoughts in a diary. He says that he has given up his shameful lifestyle and is ready to begin a new, pure life. Rochester tells Jane he is rearing Adele in order to atone the sins of his youth. Rochester shares with Jane his past infatuation with Celine Warrens, a French opera dancer he mistakenly thought loved him. One night, He overheard her with another man who ridiculed his deformities, leading him to end their relationship. Celine claimed that Adele was his daughter, but Rochester doubted it since she didn't resemble him. Years later, Celine deserted Adele, fleeing to Italy with a musician. Although Rochester refuses to acknowledge Adele as his daughter, he felt pity for the abandoned girl and brought her to England. At 2 o'clock one morning, Jane hears a demonic laugh outside her bedroom door and the sound of fingers brushing against the panels. She thinks it might be Pilot, Rochester's dog, wandering the hallways. But then she hears a door opening. Going into the hallway, she sees smoke billowing from Rochester's room. She rushes into his chamber and discovers the curtains on fire and his bed surrounded by tongues of flame. Unable to wake him, she deluges the bed with water. Rochester won't let Jane call for help. Instead, he says that he must pay a visit to the third floor. He tells Jane that Grace Poole was the culprit and then thanks her warmly for saving his life. He asks Jane to keep this incident a secret. On the morning following the fire, Jane dreads seeing Rochester, but his behavior hasn't changed. Watching the servants cleaning Rochester's room, Jane is amazed to find Grace Poole sewing new curtain rings. Grace seems calm for a woman who tried to commit murder the previous night. Like the other servants, Grace seems to believe that Rochester fell asleep with his candle lit and the curtains caught on fire. Grace advises Jane to bolt her door every night. Throughout their conversation, Grace gives no sign of guilt at having set the fire, astonishing Jane with her self-possession and hypocrisy. Jane is curious about Grace's role in the household. Why hasn't he fired Grace following the previous night's near murderous arson? At first, Jane believes Rochester might be in love with Grace, but rejects this idea because of Grace's unattractive and matronly appearance. Jane is dismayed to learn that Rochester has left the house to attend a party at the Lees, home of Mr. Ashton, and will be gone for several days. She is particularly upset to learn that a beautiful woman, Miss Blanche Ingram, will be at the party. Recognizing that she is falling in love with Rochester, Jane tries to discipline her feelings by drawing two pictures, a self-portrait in crayon and an imaginary picture of Blanche on ivory. Whenever her feelings for Mr. Rochester become too intense, Jane compares her own plainness with Blanche's beauty. Jane is very disappointed when Rochester hasn't returned in a week, and Mrs. Fairfax suggests that he might go directly to Europe, not returning to Thornfield for a year or more. After 2 weeks, Rochester sends a letter telling Mrs. Fairfax that he will arrive in 3 days, along with a party of people. One day, Jane overhears some of the servants discussing Grace, emphasizing how much Grace is being paid. From this conversation, Jane concludes that there is a mystery at Thornfield from which she is being purposely excluded. Rochester and his guests arrive. Together, they give Jane an impression of upper-class elegance, unlike anything she has ever experienced. When Rochester summons Jane and Adele to meet the party, Adele is ecstatic, but Jane is nervous and remains inconspicuously in a window seat. Jane gives her impressions of the guests, including the dark, majestic Blanche Ingram, whom she thinks Rochester must admire. Jane tries to sneak away from the party, but Rochester stops her. He notices she looks depressed and wonders why. At first, he insists that she return to the drawing room, but when he sees tears in her eyes, he allows her to leave. In future, though, she must appear in the drawing room every evening. A gypsy woman arrives from a nearby camp and wants to tell the fortunes of everybody. Lady Ingram wants the old woman sent away, but Blanche insists upon having her fortune told. After 15 minutes with the old woman, Blanche returns and has obviously received disappointing news. Mary Ingram and Amy and Louisa Ashton have their fortunes read together and return laughing, impressed by a gypsy's intimate knowledge of their lives. Finally, the gypsy insists upon telling Jane's fortune. Jane isn't frightened. Jane enters the library and finds the gypsy woman seated snugly in an easy chair. Despite Jane's protests to the contrary, the gypsy woman tells she is cold, sick, and silly. She foretells Jane is very close to happiness. If Jane made a movement towards it, bliss would result. Soon the gypsy's speech has wrapped Jane in a dreamlike state, and she is surprised by how well the old woman knows the secrets of her heart. Later in the evening, Jane tells Rochester about Mason's arrival. He is visibly upset by this news. Rochester worries that Mason has told her something grave or mysterious about him. Later that night, she hears Rochester happily leading Mason to his room. That night, Jane hears a desperate cry for help and rushes to find the party in the hallway, uncertain of what's happening. Rochester reassures everyone it was just a servant's bad dream, but Jane knows that's not true. He later asks her for help with an injured Richard Mason, instructing her to avoid talking to him. As dawn breaks, Rochester returns with a surgeon and a special cordial for Mason, claiming it will help him. After Mason leaves, Rochester and Jane stroll in the gardens. He shares a hypothetical story about a wild boy seeking redemption, and Jane responds that a sinner should rely on God for reform. Bessie gives the news of her cousin John's death and says Mrs. Reed is asking for Jane. She travels to Gateshead, where Bessie welcomes her. Reuniting with her cousins, Jane feels her old resentments fade. She learns that Mrs. Reed's animosity stems from jealousy over Jane's mother. While sketching, Jane bonds with Georgina, who begins to confide in her. Jane discovers a letter from her uncle, John Eyre, revealing he wanted to adopt her and leaving her his fortune. But Mrs. Reed never sent it due to her hatred. After Mrs. Reed's death, Jane stays for a month, helping her cousins prepare for their departures. A letter from Mrs. Fairfax informs that Rochester is in London preparing for his marriage to Blanche. Returning to Thornfield, Jane feels a sense of unease about her future, but is happy to see Rochester, who seems unusually joyful. However, she notices no wedding plans are underway, and she has never loved him anymore. Returning to Thornfield, Jane feels a sense of unease about her future, but is happy to see Mr. Rochester, who seems unusually joyful. It's a beautiful midsummer's night. As the sun sets, Jane walks around the gardens of Thornfield. Smelling Rochester's cigar from a window, Jane moves into a more secluded space of the orchard, but Rochester is now in the garden. Jane tries to escape unseen, but he speaks to her, asking her to look at an interesting moth. Although uncomfortable being alone with Rochester at night, Jane is unable to find a reasonable excuse for leaving him. During their ensuing conversation, Rochester tells Jane she'll soon need to leave Thornfield forever because he's finally marrying Miss Ingram. Rochester teasingly tells her of a governess position in Ireland. Together, they sit on a bench under a chestnut tree to discuss Jane's trip. She reveals her love for him, and Rochester admits his strong feelings for Jane. He proposes marriage. At first, Jane doesn't believe he's serious, but she reads the truth in his face and accepts the proposal. He declares that God has sanctioned their union and he doesn't care what society thinks of the relationship. A flash of lightning sends them rushing home through the rain. They are soaked, and when Rochester helps her out of her coat, he kisses her repeatedly. Jane looks up to see Mrs. Fairfax watching, pale and amazed. The next morning, Jane wakes. She feels transformed. Even her face looks different, no longer plain. Believing Jane has taken an immoral turn, Mrs. Fairfax is cool and quiet at breakfast. But Jane feels she must let Rochester give explanations. When she walks up to the schoolroom in search of Adele, Jane finds Rochester instead. He calls her Jane Rochester, which she finds frightening, and tells her the wedding will be in 4 weeks. Jane doesn't believe the wedding will actually happen. It would be a fairy tale, too much happiness for a real human. Rochester vows to make the world recognize Jane's beauty, but she worries that he's trying to transform her into a costumed ape. Jane is upset by Mrs. Fairfax's response to the news of engagement. Rather than being delighted with the relationship, Mrs. Fairfax wants Jane to maintain a distance from Rochester because she is worried about the difference between their ages and social classes. Later that day, Jane and Rochester drive to Milcote to make purchases for the wedding, and Adele rides with them. They shop for silk and jewels, making Jane feel like a doll. She decides to write her uncle in Madeira when she returns home, reasoning that she'd be more comfortable accepting Rochester's gift if she knew she'd one day have her own money to contribute to the relationship. That evening, Rochester sings Jane a romantic song, but she has no intention of sinking into a bathos of sentiment. She plans to keep her distance until after the wedding vows. As Jane prepares for her wedding next day, she struggles to label her luggage with Mrs. Rochester, feeling it's not yet real. They share a final dinner at Thornfield before their honeymoon. Jane shares a disturbing experience from the night before. She found a luxurious veil from Rochester and had a dream of a feeble child she couldn't save. In the dream, Thornfield transformed into a ruin and she fell while trying to see Rochester. She awoke to see a strange, ghastly woman who covered her face with the veil, then tore it and trampled it before looking at Jane, causing her to faint. When Jane wakes up, she finds the torn veil on the floor, confirming it was not a dream. Rochester thanks God that Jane wasn't harmed, and then suggests that the woman must have been Grace Poole. In a state between sleeping and waking, Jane simply didn't recognize her. He promises to explain everything in a year and a day after their marriage. Rochester insists that Jane sleep in Adele's bed this night with the door securely fastened. On her wedding day, Jane dresses in a simple veil she made herself. At the church, just before the ceremony begins, a voice interrupts, declaring the wedding invalid due to an impediment. That is, Rochester has a living wife, Bertha Mason, whom he married 15 years ago. Richard Mason confirms this and Rochester admits he intended to commit bigamy. He takes everyone back to Thornfield to meet Bertha, who is found behaving like a wild animal. After a struggle, he restrains her. Briggs informs Jane that her uncle John Eyre had warned Mason about the marriage as he was dying and unable to help her himself. Overwhelmed by despair, Jane locks herself in her room and turns to God in silent prayer. Later that afternoon, Jane awakes, wondering what she should do. Leave Thornfield at once is the answer. At first, she doesn't think she can leave Rochester, but an inner voice tells her she both can and should. Jane leaves her room, tripping over Rochester, who sits in a chair outside the door. He carries her down to the library, offering her wine and food. Rochester plans to lock Thornfield up, send Adele away to school, and escape with Jane to a villa in the south of France, where they would live both virtually and nominally as husband and wife. Jane won't accept his logic. If she lived with him, she would be his mistress, a position she doesn't want. Afraid of his passionate nature, Jane calls to God for help. Rochester shares his family history, explaining how his greedy father left everything to his older brother Roland. Sent to Jamaica, Rochester married Bertha, drawn in by her beauty and wealth. After their honeymoon, he discovered her family's tragic history of mental illness, which ultimately led to Bertha's insanity. Contemplating suicide, he chose to return to Europe with her instead. Over 10 years, he sought love but only found mistresses, leading Jane to realize she could never live with him as just another of his despised partners. That night, Jane dreams of her mother urging her to flee temptation. Determined, she packs a few belongings, takes her purse with 20 shillings, and quietly leaves Thornfield, rejecting the chance for a temporary escape with Rochester. 2 days after leaving Thornfield, Jane is dropped off in Whitcross by the coachman, having run out of money and accidentally leaving her belongings in the coach. She spends the night in the heath, praying to God. The next day, she walks until she finds a town, but receives little help, finally getting a slice of bread from a farmer. She notices a house and, after being initially turned away, is offered shelter by St. John Rivers, who believes she is an unusual case. The Rivers' sister Diana and Mary care for her, and Jane introduces herself as Jane Elliot. After 3 days in bed, Jane recovers, and as she helps in the kitchen, she befriends Hannah, the servant. She learns about the Rivers' financial struggles and the recent death of their father. Over the next month, Jane grows close to Diana and Mary, sharing interests and reading together, while St. John remains distant. As the sisters prepare to return to work as governesses, St. John offers Jane a teaching position in Morton, which she finds appealing despite its simplicity. He suggests that she won't stay long due to her longing for social stimulation. Meanwhile, the Rivers learn their uncle John has died, leaving his fortune to another relative. Jane settles into her new role as a village schoolmistress in Morton, teaching a class of 20 students, most of whom struggle with basic skills. Though some are eager to learn, Jane feels degraded and questions whether she made the right choice, being a free and honest teacher or Rochester's mistress. One day, Rosamond Oliver arrives, and Jane senses St. John's affection for her. As Jane teaches her students, she begins to see their potential and enjoys their company. Rosamond often visits the school, and Jane is asked to draw her portrait. During a visit, St. John brings Jane a poetry book and watches the painting of Rosamond by Jane. He contemplates marrying Rosamond, but ultimately decides against it, believing she wouldn't suit his missionary ambitions. When St. John notices something on Jane's paper, he gives her a strange look before abruptly leaving. During a snowstorm, Jane reads Marmion when St. John arrives. He reveals that he discovered her identity through a piece of paper with her name on it. St. John informs her that he is St. John Eyre Rivers, making him her cousin. Her uncle, Mr. Eyre, has died and left her a fortune of £20,000. Jane is shocked, but longs for family to share it with. Excited about her newfound relatives, Jane decides to divide her inheritance among them, giving each £5,000, believing that love and family are her true wealth. Despite St. John's suggestion to use her fortune for social standing, Jane prioritizes love over status. Christmas arrives, and Jane is closing the Morton School, feeling beloved by her students. St. John urges her to dedicate her life to working with the poor, but Jane desires to enjoy life as well. While preparing for Diana and Mary's visit, Jane notices St. John's growing control over her, leading to tension between them. He proposes that she accompany him to India as his wife, but Jane refuses, wanting to go as his sister instead. Their disagreement leads to further conflict, and suddenly Jane hears her name being called out in Rochester's voice. It strengthens her resolve to resist St. John's influence. The next day, Jane decides to visit Rochester. She discovers Thornfield is a ruined shell after Bertha set it on fire, and Rochester has been injured. She finds him at Ferdine, and their reunion is joyful, though tinged with his physical scars. Jane assures Rochester of her love, and they finally marry in a quiet ceremony. Afterward, Jane helps Adele to grow into a good natured young woman and learns that the River sisters have married, while St. John remains as a missionary in India, though nearing death. Now married for 10 years, Jane expresses her deep happiness, noting that Rochester's sight is gradually returning, allowing him to see their son. The final words of the novel are of St. John's. Amen, even so come, Lord Jesus. And that's a wrap. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos. This is me signing off. Till then, keep reading.